I'm Director of Historic Preservation at the Lower Merion Conservancy. And I know that many people on this call are either members or know what the Conservancy does, but we're a local nonprofit member-supported organization. And we have mission areas in historic preservation, the health of the watershed, open space, and sustainability. So we do give quite a few lectures or events. We sponsor events in the spring and the fall. And tonight we're extremely lucky to have Bob Thomas as our speaker on the main line of public works. And we'll learn much more about that tonight during Bob's lecture. But first, I'd just like to introduce our speaker, Bob Thomas. For many of you, Bob needs no introduction at all. He's a nationally recognized architect and a planner, and he's a founding partner at the Philadelphia firm of Campbell Thomas. He's also chair of the Philadelphia Historical Commission, vice president and co-founding board member of the Philadelphia Parks Alliance, and he is a past president of the Philadelphia Bicycle Coalition of Greater Philadelphia. Bob's professional work is focused on historic preservation, sustainability, community revitalization. At his firm, he's now the partner in charge for trail greenway development and heritage corridor projects. Bob has directed or has been involved with the creation of many trails, including the Schuylkill River Trail, the Radnor Multi-Use Trail, and the Perkiomen Trail, among many others. His commitment to improving pedestrian and bicycle transportation experiences through all of this work has been recognized and celebrated by leading rail-to-trail environmental organizations. Bob has been a peerless supporter of the Conservancy, and in the past few years, he's given probably 3 lectures for us, and most recently, last Saturday, as he noted, he led about 10 of us on an epic cycling tour where we traced the line of the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad. So let me just tell you how I think this evening is going to unfold. Bob's, of course, our leader here, so make any decisions that you need to in that regard. But I think that we'll expect your lecture to be 30, 40 minutes. Is that right, Bob?
Yes, I'll try to.
Okay. And then during that time, audience members are welcome to type questions into the Q&A box or the chat box at the bottom. Oh, no, we decided not to do that. Is that right, Bob? We'll have people just, since we don't have too many people on this call, if you have a question after Bob's finished his lecture, you can kind of just pipe up, I guess, on the Zoom screen.
But I think, Kathleen, if people want to chat, they can absolutely type it in the chat, and then we'll take them in order.
That's right.
At the end of the lecture.
Right. Okay, that's great, Maureen. So for people who don't actually also want to get up on the screen, please do type your questions into the chat box.
Right, and I think what we'll do.
So without further ado, we welcome Bob Thomas.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I think please be aware, if you are putting something in the chat box, we will not be looking at it during the lecture over the next 30, 45 minutes. But looking at the questions, and I think Maureen is going to read them out in the order in which they were received, and then we can take other questions by raising hands. But first of all, everybody knows the main line, certainly in this area, and it's known well beyond. But most people do not know about the main line of public works and why it was set up. Well, if you go back to the 18th century, as the United States began to grow, there were the 13 original colonies, but then there was a Northwest Territory that was added to the United States. And you can see here the dates when the territories became states. Ohio in 1803, Indiana in 1816, Illinois in 1818. There's one big problem though, one serious problem. These lands here, as you know, are very rich farmland and have other resources as well. And of course, any manufacturing or shipping was going along here in the East Coast. And there was really no easy way to get from one place to the other. Just move ahead. This is the topographic problem with Pennsylvania. I think you can see pretty clearly, here we are at Philadelphia, New Jersey, southern New Jersey, the Delaware Water Gap's up here. And that's where, the Ridge and Valley country begins. And then you have the Allegheny Mountains. And this is actually what's called the Eastern Continental Divide. Everything from here flows to the Ohio River and down to the Gulf of Mexico. Everything here flows east to either Chesapeake Bay or the Delaware River and out to the Atlantic Ocean. Getting over that is a serious problem. So everybody wanted to get to Ohio. You've all seen the old movies with the wagon, California or bust. Well, in the late 17, early 1800s, it was Ohio or bust. So that's why a lot of names that you've heard, like the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, right? If it was done a century later, it would have been the Baltimore and California Railroad. But Ohio was the big thing. And all the cities wanted to be connected across the Alleghenies or through the mountains. And Pennsylvania was very much like it is today. The main line of public works was eventually built by money appropriated by the Pennsylvania legislature, but they really didn't want to do it. And part of it was an extraordinarily courageous, expensive proposition to build something from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh in the early 1800s. It was almost inconceivable. But at the same time, New York City was looking to get to the Midwest, and they built the Erie Canal between 1817 and 25 from Albany to Buffalo. Albany, of course, is at tidewater, so ships still go up to Albany from the ocean, but then they could get through the canal and come out to Lake Erie and on to the other parts of the Midwest. The other canal was the C&O Canal, which was built starting in 1828, a little earlier than the main line of public works. It took a long time to get to Cumberland. There were tunnels and things. This is the Paw Paw Tunnel. I've been through that. And what's really nice is that by a stroke of luck and a lot of hard work on the parts of a number of very good people, this was saved from becoming a parkway or an expressway and is now the C&O Canal National Historical Park. The Erie Canal, interestingly enough, was, as were so many of them, was rebuilt several times. It was widened, enlarged. The last time was in the early 20th century. This is a section, I took this photograph on an older portion, which is preserved actually as parkland, with the towpath being a very nice bike route. But the point was that these other things scared Pennsylvania to death. Philadelphia was the ascendant city before New York built the Erie Canal. And look what happened. People knew that would happen. So there was this push to get something in Pennsylvania from Philly somehow to get over the mountains. And it wasn't easy to figure out. Well, what they did was to come up with this idea of building a hybrid system. So there was a railroad that ran from Philadelphia to Columbia, known as the Philadelphia-Columbia Railroad. Then when you got there, you would transfer to a canal boat, which would go up the Susquehanna River and then turn off to the Juniata River at Clark's Ferry and follow that all the way up through the mountains to Hollidaysburg. And Hollidaysburg, that's where you get right near Altoona. You've heard of the Horseshoe Curve, which was the ultimate solution for getting over the mountains, but that wasn't built to the later 1850s. Then there was a portage railroad. And why would it be called a portage railroad? What were they portaging? They were portaging canal boats. So rather than taking everything out of a canal barge or boat, putting it into a some vehicle, taking it over the mountains down, they actually carried the boats over the mountain. When they got to Johnstown, then they got back in the water and went all the way down the Conemaugh River to the Allegheny to Pittsburgh. They joined the Monongahela, and of course, from there it's all the way down to New Orleans. So we're going to take a journey. I tried to find some pictures from early to mid 19th century of what would this be like going from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. So here we have a view of Pittsburgh in 1817, not too long before the main line of public works came here. And it's interesting, it says, taken from a sketch drawn by Mrs. E.C. Gibson, wife of James Gibson, Esquire, the Philadelphia Bar, while on her wedding tour in 1817. It sounds like my wife Nancy and I with me in my sketchbook during our honeymoon. So people were doing the same thing 200 years ago. But this is how small Pittsburgh was. And then not too long after that, the city started to grow when the canal came in. Interestingly enough, there was a big battle between the borough of Allegheny and the city of Pittsburgh as to which side the canal should be on. And Allegheny Borough won. Here it is, Allegheny. And as a result, the canal came in on the right bank. And for those of you who don't know, I use the term left bank and right bank because all these rivers and things wind around all over the place. If you're going downstream, the bank that's to your left is the left bank, and the bank to your right is the right bank. So it came down the right bank, but they had to get into the city, and it led to the construction of massive structures. And here's a picture of it. There was actually an aqueduct that carried the canal across from the borough of Allegheny into the city of Pittsburgh. So from there, let's just go back to the map. You would proceed up the Allegheny River, turn into the Canal River, and go through very mountainous country to get to Johnstown. And here we are in Johnstown. Getting into Johnstown, which is where the boats were transferred to the inclined planes. There was actually, here's a weigh-in lock. And of course, everything was Greek revival in those days. You can see that. Looks a little like the waterworks. So obviously they were weighing cargo and charging freight charges and so forth. This is a photo I took standing along the Canal River, just a little bit from the downtown. There's a wonderful historic area, and they have a project called the Steeples Project, where they're reusing so many of these amazing churches for other purposes and doing a good job of it. But this just gives a sense of what the land is like and the narrow gorges that were here and how wild it was to get through all of this. So obviously, you've heard of the Johnstown flood. Most people don't relate the Johnstown flood to the main line of public works. They just think there was a big rainstorm and a big flood. But what was interesting is that because there was a canal here, I'm sorry, the canal starting at Johnstown going down, and because of the need to have water in that canal, and every time you open the locks to let boats go up or down, you lose water. So there was a need to store water, have to feed water into the system. So here below South Fork, they built a South Fork Dam and this huge lake to capture water so that during dry periods, they could release water and make sure there was always enough water in the canal. Well, the main line of public works, the Allegheny Inclines, they went out of business pretty much by the 1850s, by 1860. When the Pennsylvania Railroad pushed its train service through. So this lake was here and somebody got an idea, gee, why don't we build a wonderful place for people who live in Pittsburgh? The wealthy peaks can come out by train. It's not that far to Johnstown, and they could stay at this wonderful South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Well, there was only one problem. The people who designed this did a good job, in terms of how high the lake should be and how high the dam should be. But in order to get more resort houses along the lake, they needed to take carriages across the dam, and the dam wasn't wide enough. So they said, well, gee, the dam is built in a prism. We'll just cut down the dam several feet so you can drive a carriage across. Of course, there was a reason the dam was that high. Some engineers had figured out, hey, if you get a really bad storm, you need to have that storage capacity. Well, they didn't. And of course, the big storm came and it ruptured the dam, and all this water came down the valley, and a couple thousand people died, not only from the flooding, but as things were destroyed, gas lines were opened up. So it was a combination of water and fire. It was just horrendous. And when you go there today, they never restored the dam, but the national park is here, and you can get a whole explanation and see where South Fork Lake used to be. So it just shows that, sometimes using old things is good, but you really have to be careful. And I see that in architecture as a preservation architect, where people come into an old building and say, oh, we're going to put in a really nice bathroom here. We'll cut through these wooden beams that are in the way. Of course, they're holding up the building. So you really have to watch out. Let's go to the next slide. There we are. Climbing up the incline from Johnstown, it's really beautiful mountain country, very steep, very difficult. And at one point, what they did was to build a railroad tunnel. It was the first railroad tunnel built in America. I think the Union Canal tunnel near Lebanon, on the Union Canal between Reading and Middletown, I've been told is the oldest transportation tunnel because that carried a canal, and you can go see that today. But this one here was restored by the National Park Service and is a great thing to see. All right, so here's a diagram. So after you've come up the Conemaugh River, then your canal boats, and see here, portage, it says. These boats were also sectional so they could bend. So the idea was that it was like a container, that it would be transferred from one thing to another. You know, in the old days, before containers were big with ocean shipping, there were all kinds of longshoremen who unloaded stuff and packed it into other vehicles and so forth. With a container, you just pick it up out of the ship, you put it on a flat car and a train, you know, it goes. And the same idea was here. There are even drawings of some of the canal boats actually down in not too far from Independence Hall, where they were hauled by horses and then out onto the railroad and so forth. So the canal boats had carriages to carry these boats. Well, they had 10 inclined planes where they started in Johnstown. The first plane number 1 was here. There was the Staple Bend Tunnel, the Conemaugh Viaduct it went over. And then as you got closer to the ridge of the mountains, to the Eastern Continental Divide, then there was one after another all the way up, and then coming down again to Hollidaysburg, where you then put the boats into the canal and went all the way down to Harrisburg and Columbia. The National Park Service has the Allegheny Incline National Historical Park, and you'll see another photograph in a moment, but this is an old sketch of what it looked like at the top. And why were they all these all these chimneys here and all this equipment? Well, you could see there's a cable here. And what they did was attach the cable to, this is called a Barney, the cable was attached to, and then the cars, and then using the cables, the car was hauled up. I believe, and I'm not a licensed civil engineer, I'm a licensed architect, but I certainly read about this stuff. And with the 2 tracks, obviously that helped, you know, to avoid blockages that you had with like a single track railroad, but also you could counterbalance. You know, if you were pulling something up, you could let something down. And what they had inside this area with the stationary engines were the engines then powered. Here you can see these are representations of the tracks that were here, and underneath were these huge wheels that pulled the cables. We're not be able to see you raising hands, but I asked, if you asked you to raise your hand, quite a few of you would know the Brooklyn Bridge. And you might even know the name of John Roebling, who's the one who designed the Brooklyn Bridge using wire rope. Well, Roebling got his start out here on the inclines. And what was happening is the ropes that were used to pull the cars up and the people were made of hemp, and they would break regularly. Well, what happened when the rope broke? Well, the cars went running down to the bottom, smashed, people died, goods were lost. So he had the idea of making a cable out of wire rope, small threads of wire spun together, and which was very strong and less likely to fracture. He went to the state legislature and they said, interesting idea, but we don't have any money. You know, it's always the same story. They said, but Mr. Roebling, if you would at your own expense install your cables on one of these inclines, we'll take a look at it. So he risked everything. He risked his career, his fortune, what money he had, and did it, but it was very successful. That led to wire rope. It wasn't long after that we were seeing suspension bridges in Cincinnati and other places. It really was quite something, and it happened on the main line of public works. So here's another illustration from the period. You can see a train here. There's the engine house. And next to that is an old building that's been restored by the National Park Service. This is a recreation here and a recreation of the tracks. But the house, I think, was still there, perhaps in ruins or in disrepair, but it's been restored. And it was just like there were taverns and things all along the stagecoach routes or the canals. They were here as well. And this was a place, you know, for getting refreshments and whatnot. And also just because this, I think, was the highest point, you know, admiring the views and so forth. All right, once you come down, I'll go back to the map for a second. Where is it? Oh, there. Yeah, once you come down to Hollidaysburg, you get to the Juniata River. And the Juniata River cuts through the mountains with many narrow, they're called narrows, like Jack's Narrows and this Narrows and Lewisburg Narrows. And the reason is, I'll go back to the topo map for a moment. So here's the mountains, and they come down. This part of Pennsylvania has a physiography known as the Ridge and Valley country. And the strange thing about this, and it's really beautiful, is that most rivers, you know, fall, like here, they're in a valley, you know, with hills and things on each side. In Pennsylvania, the rivers cut through the mountains. At one time, there were rivers that flowed through these mountain valleys, but then other rivers came down, I guess, with glacial flow and cut their way through, like the Delaware Water Gap. But then you also have Schuylkill Gap and Wind Gap and Lehigh Gap, and one after the other. So the thing about the Juniata River, it winds its way through, and here's a Narrows, here's another one, goes all the way through Raystown, you know, gets out to Altoona. And then, of course, the trains today assault the mountains on the Horseshoe Curve. But that's part of the geography. Let's go back. So once you get down from the mountains, it's still very hilly. You still have places where it's very narrow to get through, where it cuts through the mountains. But this is what the canal looked like, the Juniata section, or the of the main line of public works. So this was from Hollidaysburg all the way down the Juniata River to the Susquehanna, and then down through Harrisburg and down to Columbia. Along the way, there were all kinds of canal towns. They were very prosperous. This is a mural that you can actually see when you go to the beautiful town of Newport. Newport today is off the highway. It's off the canal. And while there's a beautiful station in ruins there, Amtrak goes through but doesn't stop. So they're really kind of isolated, but they've really cleaned up the town. And this is Newport Square, and businesses now have come back. People know this is an interesting place to stop or even stay. I enjoy, as a bicyclist, taking the back roads and using this. But this mural is actually on the side of a building in Newport, and it was some arts foundation that funded it, just to give you an idea of life during the canal period. That's the Susquehanna, that's the Juniata River over there, and that's the towpath. And this boy who's pulling the mule seems out of scale with everything else, but nevertheless, it's really pretty nice. The other thing, just notice they undergrounded all their wires, and what a difference that makes. All right, coming down to Harrisburg, you can find evidences of the canal today, just in some of the streets that are there. But here you can see north is this way. Here's the Capitol is right here. There's the Capitol building. And this is about 1889. So it's about the time that the beautiful Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Railroad Station was constructed that still serves Amtrak and a whole bunch of bus lines. There was a bridge over here to take trains out into the Cumberland Valley. These tracks went down to Philadelphia, and then they separated at a certain point so the trains could go to Philadelphia or to Washington. This is the Lebanon Valley line coming in from the Reading. And what you see, here's the canal. See, it says Pennsylvania Canal. It goes all through here. And there's even canal here, and you see a canal basin. That was important because you had to have a place where you could stop your canal boats, load and unload them. That was important. And I was really lucky to just find recently this view drawn about 1855. And you're looking downstream on the Susquehanna River. You see the few bridges, there's a train coming across, but fortunately they highlighted the canal. You can see the canals right here. And there's a canal basin, and then this. Harrisburg is on a floodplain. Once you go through town, you get to the Hill District, you cross the canal, and then you go up. And that, of course, is away from any place that floods. The rest of this is really subject to flooding. And here's a old view of the Capitol, about 1855. But you can see how the canal was a really important corridor. And it went down here and joined the river. Downstream from Harrisburg is a town that's much less well known called Columbia. And one of the questions you might have is, why did they take the original railroad from Philadelphia to Columbia? And the answer is that Columbia was much closer to Lancaster than Harrisburg. They wanted to get to the river as soon as they could so that they could reach the area where they would be taking things by boat. It was also a question of topography as well. They could get to Columbia. There was an inclined plane, if I remember correctly. Someone could correct me if I'm wrong, at the last part to Columbia. But this is Columbia, about 1897. And what you see is this bridge here. There's been a bridge across the Susquehanna River here since, I believe, the 18-teens, about 1816. There was a covered bridge built. It's like a mile, it was a mile long. And that bridge stood until the Civil War, when it was burned down to prevent the Confederates from crossing the river and taking over Philadelphia. This was during the assault at Gettysburg. But this bridge was here. It carried both carriages and trains. Not the original bridge, because there were no trains in 1816, but it was rebuilt several times. The last rebuild was about 1930, and I'm going to show you a picture of that in a moment. It's the Lincoln Highway Bridge. But the town was very, very prosperous there because you had all the trains coming here, you had all the canal boats, and it wasn't just the main line of public works. You can go today across the river to Wrightsville on the York County side and see, and you can see signs pointing out the basin and the canal of the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal. So you could, exchange things and take things on a canal boat all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay at Havre de Grace. So there was a lot of interconnectivity. This is a picture about 1900 at the Canal Basin in Columbia, and you get to see how busy things were. It's really something. I mean, it's kind of peaceful today, but boy, there was a lot of activity going on. And a lot of manufacturing as well, with all the railroads and canals. At this time, about 1930, the bridge was replaced with multiple concrete arch spans. And this is the Lincoln Highway Bridge. It's the old US 30. Later on, US 30 was made into an expressway that bypasses the center of Columbia. And you see that over here. I think this is now Route 462. But this is a wonderful bridge. It has a great walkway, and it's a wonderful place to look at the river. The other thing, which is really nice, is the Susquehanna Gateway Heritage Area operates a visitor center on this side that was built by the Borough of Columbia. And it serves all sorts of interests here. Also, in terms of trails, you have the September 11th National Memorial Trail. You have the you have the Pennsylvania Highlands Trail, several trails that go through and all connect here. So this is really quite a place. Yeah, just to show you, here's the picture you saw a moment ago. And you see this is the Allegheny Portage Railroad. This is the Philadelphia and Columbia. But then here are all the other canals at the peak of the system, about 1850. So if you were going from Pittsburgh, you could also connect all the way up to Lake Erie at Erie. There was the Ohio and Pennsylvania. You could go down the Monongahela navigation. It's interesting, this branch here, the Katanning feeder, whenever you see the word feeder, the purpose of that was to bring water down from the mountains here, again, to keep the locks filled as they were used during the warm months. But the canal went up to Johnstown, across here, as we said, and then followed the Juniata River winding between the mountains down to Clark's Ferry. But then not only could you go down to Columbia and take the railroad to Philadelphia, but this is the Susquehanna and Tidewater down to Chesapeake Bay. And then you had all of that. You had the C&D Canal, which is still in operation. This is the Union Canal, which I mentioned near Lebanon, over to Reading. And then this is the Schuylkill navigation from Port Carbon all the way down to Philadelphia. You could actually go all the way up into New York State. So there was quite a network. So even when this Portage Railroad was abandoned in favor of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the canal system continued, and many of these canals continued in operation, a few of them even into the 1930s. Most of them were gone by the year 1900, though. So going east from Columbia, I love this picture. It's an old drawing in the 1840s of Lancaster. Of course, there are no cars. There's a Conestoga wagon, which you would expect in Lancaster County. But what's really interesting, when you look at the signs, the Pioneer line, it says Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. That was the line that sold tickets on the railroad. And here you see the train. And over here, you actually see there's a canal boat with, and this sign for this American hotel, just, really giving you the character of the area. Now, this was downtown. The railroad went right through town. And what happened later on was, as the Pennsylvania Railroad modernized things, they built a new station, which is a beautiful station, still in use today by Amtrak and many of the buses out there. And that took the trains out of the downtown. Some of this line is actually now a greenway and trail on the west side of the downtown Lancaster. That brings us from Lancaster over Chester County, and we get close to Philadelphia. And this is, of course, Montgomery County. Athensville is the old name for Ardmore. And this is an interesting map I found that shows, this is the current Amtrak SEPTA main line going up here. So there's Overbrook Station, Marion, Narberth, Wynwood, Ardmore. But then this shows the line that came out of downtown Philadelphia and came up this way and crossed the Columbia Bridge. The Columbia Bridge just was 100 years old a year ago. The current one opened in 1921. And its original purpose was to bring trains from Broad and Callowhill, where the terminal was of the Philadelphia Columbia. They crossed the river. They did not turn and go up the river as they do today. They went up an inclined plane. Here it is, inclined plane, to get up to the top of Belmont Plateau. And that was always the question, is how do you get out of Philadelphia when you have all this steep topography that you have to conquer to get a train out of here? And several people asked me, it comes up regularly, is it, why didn't they just build a train line straight through like this? And the answer, of course, is that they had such an elevation change to make. They needed a longer railroad in order to keep the grade at the proper grade for running trains. If they went straight ahead, it would have been too steep. They would have needed an inclined plane like they did here. But anyway, this came up, went through what's now part of Fairmount Park. Here you can see follows Conshohocken Avenue, actually goes over. This is the Kinwood Station right here. So that railroad cut underneath Conshohocken State Road is actually the rail bed of the original Philadelphia Columbia, right in that area. But then the railroad went here and turned. This is Bala Avenue. And you can, when you go there, I enjoy bicycling it. It's quiet, but it's a long gradual curve because that was the railroad. Then you can see here, it followed some of what's today Montgomery Avenue. It went through what's now Narberth, and there's no evidence of it left because obviously when this was built, it was all farmland. So they just went straight ahead. When this got gridded up and turned into a borough and into rows and lots and lots of twins and other houses, there's no evidence left. But then as you get down here, this is coming into Ardmore, and you go here towards Haverford College. This is Railroad Avenue out here. And that, in fact, is the bed of the Philadelphia Columbia. And you can see the street signs, and that's why. And then eventually they joined at some point. Here's one of the most remarkable things, probably one of the most, there's several really, really interesting things that you can see. This is the thrift shop at Bryn Mawr Hospital, right? And this is the old railroad line right here. This was the Whitehall Station that was built about 1860. But Pensy kept some of the Philadelphia Columbia for use for other purposes, or maybe they had some freight service or whatever, or some different passenger services. But if you look at this photograph, you can see this is the same building. It's just that here's the road that you see today, right? And going out towards County Line Road, and you can see it was a railroad, not a road. So that's really pretty interesting. And it's just nice that this building has survived. And you can match up windows and even some of the ornamentation. Yeah, so near the Kinwood Station, this is coming in east from Whitehall or Bryn Mawr. You can see Bala Avenue here. Now, not every curvy road is a railroad bed, but this one is. And as you get to Kinwood Station, they actually have a display of the sleeper stones that were found at the station and uncovered, and they've been actually lined up in an exhibit to give you an idea of what a piece of track might have looked like. So they're basically big, heavy blocks with holes drilled in them so they could connect the rails to them. And of course, the stones were separated by space, so there was room for the horses to walk through. They are actually visible in their original location as you come into Philadelphia. This is Edgeley Avenue. This is Fairmount Park, and it's right behind the one of the retirement homes that was built in the 1890s. And it's, which one is it? It starts with an S. I'll remember in a moment. But I was there when this sign was installed in the year 2000, and it just tells you what it was. Yeah, and built in response to intense competition from adjacent states. Yeah, so it was acquired in 1857. The stone blocks or the stone sleepers have remained visible here. And actually, the Simpson House, they've done the job of keeping these visible, and they needed maybe a little more trimming. When I was here for the dedication of the historic marker, there were some railroad enthusiasts who were here, and they said, well, you know, this was 2 tracks. And they started digging around during the ceremonies, and with a rod, and they found the second row of stone sleepers. But what's amazing is these stones are where they were set in 1834. It's pretty amazing. And it's nice that they're there. This is the beginning of the Belmont Incline. So going down the Belmont Incline, this is Fairmount Park today. And this is the Columbia Bridge. And you can see Philadelphia in the distance. And of course, today, this is a concrete arch bridge that comes across, and the tracks turn and follow the river. But when this was built, the trains turned here and then started up the inclined plane. They were connected to these cables and pulled all the way up to Belmont Plateau. So this takes you down to the Schuylkill River. And then here, this is a postcard. That was the first bridge that you saw, which was a covered bridge. It was replaced by an iron bridge with all these trusses sometime, I believe, in the 1880s. And this is just before it was replaced with the modern bridge, which opened in 21. So you can see this was probably just 2 tracks, looking at the photograph carefully. And there, of course, this is the big Reading line. The main trains came out of Reading Terminal and used this line to get up here. The inclined plane came down here. It's long gone by 1917. Interestingly enough, old railroad assets tend to get reused. The Pennsylvania Turnpike, when it was built across the state, was run through the tunnels of the South Pennsylvania Railroad, which never opened up, but they built a lot of tunnels, and you can go out and see some of them today. Some of them are no longer used by the Turnpike. It's now a bike path. But in this area, in 1896, the Fairmount Park Transportation Company opened up its Fairmount Park trolley line, which went from Strawberry Mansion across the Strawberry Mansion Bridge through the park and all the way to Parkside. They took advantage of some of the main line of public works. And then they were abandoned in 1946. And then about 10 years ago, we were working for the Fairmount Park Conservancy, restoring the Fairmount Park across the Belmont Plateau cross-country course, and it was routed down the route of the trolley, which was the route of the inclined plane. It's just really interesting to see how, as human beings, we tend to take advantage of things that were left for us. It's also more interesting when you really understand what they were. This is a really handsome bridge. Interestingly enough, it was designed by Samuel Wagner, who was, I guess, probably the son or grandson of Wagner, who started the Wagner Free Institute of Science that's up at 17th and Montgomery. And one thing that's really nice is that the Wagner Institute of Science obviously publishes a journal. And back in the 20s, they had one issue of their journal that had the whole documentation of the construction of this bridge. And obviously, one reason I think that article got in there was that Samuel Wagner was the guy that designed it. And they have wonderful photos of the original bridge being taken down in the 1880s. I mean, I never thought I would get to see that. So there's a lot of things that are connected here in Philadelphia, as they are elsewhere. This then brings the line down. After it crosses the river, it follows an active line. It's a CSX freight line, used to be Reading, used to be Philadelphia and Columbia, all the way down to the Art Museum, where it then goes underneath Pennsylvania Avenue. And most people don't realize that underneath Aikens Oval is the main freight line between New York and Washington. Tremendous work was done at the beginning of the 20th century to depress the railroads that came through that part of the city. Pennsylvania Avenue was created as a cover for the railroads, and there's still vents there to let fumes out from the diesel locomotives that are operating on part of it. When I was a kid, they had stone walls around, and there's a lot of smoke coming out from the steam locomotives. But it's interesting. This is the location at Broad and Calla-Hill of the Philadelphia Columbia Terminal. This remained a very important place for freight and industry. And in 1930, the Reading Company built this magnificent building, which was both a freight station. Well, here it says, freight station with storage and office building for the Reading Railroad. It's a beautiful Art Deco building, and it is listed on the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places. And in the world of transportation, what this is today, this is a major terminal of computer networks from around the world. Apparently, the really heavy-duty cables from Europe passed through this building. And what ended up happening is the building, which it had, I remember when I was in college, my draft board was here. Antioch University had classes. There were a lot of nonprofits. It was a cheap space, kind of an odd part of town, and a building that was run down. And it got really restored nicely. The people that own it today have really done a great job restoring and respecting the building. There are actually a lot of vents here for computer work, and you don't see that. And all this, there's beautiful terracotta up here. It's a great thing. The other thing that's really nice that connects to this is the rail park, because this line that went to Broad and Columbia was then, of course, they didn't just end there. They extended it down Willow Avenue to this Delaware River. And there was also a spur that went up to Reading Terminal, which opened in 1893. So express trains and long distance trains from Philadelphia could travel this route from Reading Terminal. That, of course, is now part of the rail park. So it's really interesting how, there's still easily several dozen big freight trains every day pounding over the Allegheny Mountains on what's now CSX, what's now Norfolk Southern. And of course, it was the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the Pennsy, of course, bought out the main line of Public Works. They used that as a stepping stone. This is the Rockville Bridge over the Susquehanna River, reputedly the longest continuous stone arch bridge in the world. It's just a gem. And I think the thing I enjoy about it is not how beautiful the masonry is and the sense that, it's built to really last. But when you go over that bridge, you feel like you're leaving, the coastal plain and the cities, and you're heading into the west as you turn onto the Juniata River. It's really quite something. So with that, I would be delighted to have some discussion. Always interested to hear corrections and additions, because I've learned a lot of this. Not so much, I read books, of course. I look at maps all the time. My wife says, are you going up to your study to look at more railroad porn, in the evening? But the way I've really gotten to know this is by being an architect and out there and building trails, greenways, and working on the main line of Public Works. There's a mainline Canal Greenway, National Heritage Corridor from Harrisburg all the way to Pittsburgh. We've done work for them. So I've gotten out and learned a lot of this and walked a lot of it in doing our work and studying, how to make trails and get, a continuous greenway that's walkable, bikeable, and really works as a economic development boost to many of the old historic towns that are along this route, much of which have been bypassed. just in the way things get built. So with that, I'd be very pleased to hear some questions.
Bob, I think if you're fine, we can welcome people to unmute themselves or type questions in the chat.
That would be fine.
Maybe I could start off with a question, Bob? This is
Yes.
Kathleen. So I know, I can imagine about how long the inclined plane at Belmont is, but there were many inclined planes along this route, correct?
Yes, I understand there was one at Columbia coming down to the river, so that would be 2. There were 10 over the Alleghenies, and whether there were others, I'm not sure.
Okay, so and then the incline or the slope, I guess, would be different. How long could an incline reasonably be, or how, with the mechanism that you would pull those cars up?
That's a good question. It was really limited by the rope. And the problem that they had was the ropes would break, the hemp ropes. They were also, by the time you had a heavy duty rope that could pull a boat up, I don't know, a quarter of a mile, 3/8 of a mile, the rope weighed tons, so that was a problem also. So the wire rope approach made that very different. But of course, the inclines were built around the hemp rope technology. What their length is, you can easily go to the website of the Allegheny Inclines National Historical Park, and there are all kinds of links there. And if you want to know everything about each incline plane and where it starts and ends, also just to find out there's some trails that'll take you out and you can go experience it. I think plane number 4 is one that's particularly accessible.
Okay, thanks.
So Bob, we have 2 people waiting to ask questions. I can't tell who was first, so I'll just call on Greg Pritchard to ask his question first.
Hello, Greg. How are you doing?
Hey, Bob. Nice to see you. Sorry I missed your bike tour last weekend, but thanks so much for doing this. And just wanted to point out that there are so many sleeper blocks around the main line. It's kind of a fun scavenger hunt. People like to put them at the base of their driveways, and some have even been turned into gate posts and monuments. The Narberth War Memorial is made of them, and there's a memorial at Paoli Battlefield that's made from them. So
that's right. I've seen that. Yes.
Yeah. So it's there must have been thousands of those things. And so it makes sense that once they were tossed aside, people reused them for other things. But it's just kind of incomprehensible. Well, the whole construction is sort of incomprehensible, but the creation of those enormous heavy blocks and transporting them, installing them, and it just must have been a huge task. But I also wanted to note that we at the township were offered a pair, or maybe 3 or 4 of the blocks that were discovered in someone's garden in the English Village in Wynwood.
Yes.
It was close to where the original line ran, but not quite. So I think someone probably took them for their garden, and now the current owner didn't want them anymore. So we moved them to a township park, and we're thinking about what to do with them, whether it's some kind of interpretive display like what's at the park in Kinwood or not. So we're looking at that. So they're everywhere. Keep an eye out.
Yeah, and not just on this main line of public works. If you go up, the first railroad in New Jersey was the Camden and Amboy. Because they didn't have the technology of building a bridge over the Delaware River, you would take a ferry over to Camden and then take the Camden and Amboy, which interestingly enough is now the river line, up to Bordentown, then the line continued from there. I've seen old photos of that with both a regular railroad track, but then the old abandoned line with the stone sleepers. So it was obviously something that was used not just here.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
So Bob, next up we have Brandon's iPhone has a question.
All righty.
Hi, Bob. Brandon Halbert. Thank you very much for this. It was very interesting. I'm curious about the name, Main Line of Public Works. I always thought that the main line was coined from the Pennsylvania Railroad, but this obviously predates it. But it's also a mouthful. What what do you know about the name Main Line of Public Works? I mean, where did that, it was a state sponsored endeavor?
Yes,
Is that?
it was built by the state. So that the state appropriated and the state owned it. And of course, the state lost money every year until the 1850s when they sold it to the Pennsylvania Railroad. But the point is that there were public works all over Pennsylvania, not just this line. So of all the public works, this was, because it was the principal line across the whole state, it was given the name, the Main Line of Public Works.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank
I heard people arguing one time, well, the main line needs a Paoli. No, it actually goes out to Coatesville, you know, and I said, you're both wrong. It goes to Pittsburgh. But of course, it became associated with, you know, the magnificent suburbs that we have, you know, in Haverford, Lower Murray and Radnor Township, Tredyffrin, you know, became associated with them as a, you know, almost a cultural icon. But the actual line of public works, this was the main line.
So Bob, next we have a question from Warren Williams.
Hello, Warren.
Hello, Bob. So I had a question. Well, first of all, there are also some sleepers down at Newcastle, Delaware.
Yes.
For the train that went through Newcastle. You can still see a row of stone sleepers out by the park close to the river.
That was the Newcastle and Frenchtown Railroad.
Yeah.
And I could bring a map up, but I could just tell you that the early railroads in this country were planned to avoid rivers, to avoid mountains. They just didn't have the technology to deal with it. So there are many places where if you were going to Washington, you would actually take a train down across New Jersey that would take you out to the Delaware Bay. You'd cross over to Newcastle and you'd go to Frenchtown, and you'd take another ferry, you know, and on and on and on and on. And that way they go over relatively flat areas. So yes,
Interesting.
That's true.
So the question I had was, I had heard someplace where in the planning phase of the main line, they weren't really sure about how to do a canal from Philadelphia to Columbia. And that was always a question mark. And they sent Strickland to Great Britain, and he came back with sort of railroad technology saying, we don't need a canal between Philadelphia and Columbia. We can accomplish it through a railroad. Do you know anything about that, whether a canal was ever planned for the link between Philadelphia and Columbia?
Well, here, let me go back to the canal map. There it is. You actually could take a canal boat from Philadelphia to Harrisburg by going up the Schuylkill navigation to Reading, and then switching into the Union Canal and going down to Middletown and then getting out into the Susquehanna. I don't know for certain all the details about that decision. My guess also is that, again, when you have a canal, you have to have a supply of water. Like here, the Katanning feeder, you know, would feed water into this. So this is fairly gentle countryside once you get up at each end, and there aren't really any big pools or reservoirs that you could get.
I had heard
like here on the Union Canal, this is a feeder canal from Pine Grove. It was used also, and here on the Delaware and Raritan Canal, that actually went down here to Bordentown, and then boats came out in the Delaware River. But this canal that you walk along today is part of the DNR Canal Park. This was a feeder canal. It shows up on the old topo maps from where is it? Raven Rock, right at Bulls Island. The water's diverted into that. So my guess is that they just, when looking at technologies, they figured that trying to get enough water to service this might have been really difficult.
Yeah, I had heard that water was the problem.
Yeah, but the other thing you have to remember is it was pretty controversial about doing railroads, because by the 1830s, when these things were being planned, the canals were the proven technology.
Right.
Railroads were not. They were not considered dependable yet.
Right,
So
right.
investing this much in a railroad took a lot of gumption.
Yeah, thanks.
So Bob, we have a question from John Sigmund.
Hi, Bob. This is John with the Fairmount Park Conservancy.
Yes, good to see you or hear you.
Good to hear you as well. And I'm sorry, I'm doing what you're not supposed to do. I'm driving as we're doing this, but I'll be careful. I just, living in Woodford through a guy named Jerry Francis, who was the mainline with the Lower Merion Historical Society, he introduced me to the connection between the metaphorical Underground Railroad and the literal railroad of Philadelphia, Columbia,
Right.
with freedom seekers coming from Columbia by the false end of boxcars shipped by William Whipper. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that story and anything you know about that story in relation to the actual infrastructure.
I mean, was there a relationship between the Underground Railroad and other railroads? Only in the, from what I understand, and I'm not an expert on the Underground Railroad, there's a lot of good information available. But my understanding is that the Underground Railroad was a euphemism because it wasn't visible. And what it really was, there were people that were conductors. Those were the people with the houses, with the secret basements where they would hide people, so the slave catchers wouldn't get them. And the routes really were how you went from one house or one safe house to another. And sometimes that involved a railroad. Sometimes it just involved back roads or whatever. So I don't know that there was ever a parallel of Underground Railroad traffic. Also, people going this way were probably trying to head north towards Canada.
Yeah, I of course familiar with the metaphor, Bob. I was just specifically curious about as a means of conveyance, railroad would have been an option, and we know that at Columbia is essentially on the Mason-Dixon line. So that
Very close.
very close. Yep. So yeah, but yeah, I was just curious if you knew any of that story or how the inclined plane may have been played into that.
I don't know. I don't know what role it might have had. I have heard other things. There was a fellow whose nickname was Box Brown. Some of you might have heard his story, where he was in Richmond and he was wrapped up in a box and shipped by a railroad. And, then he got out and escaped, and he had that name, but you can look that up. But I don't think that people who were fleeing slavery would have tried to hitch a ride on a train unless they were being protected by other people. But you'd have to look into that.
So Bob, there's just a question in the chat. Can you explain the name sleeper block and the technology of how they were held in place?
Yes. Let's go back to a picture of them. Here you are. Okay. These were set, as you saw in the other slide, into the ground. They're also quite massive, so they're not likely to move if they're well packed and well set into the ground, almost like a foundation stone. The rails were attached, with spikes that were put down into these holes, and I guess lead or something was used to fill that. So because, as you saw in that other slide, only the surface was showing. So all this was underground, acting as a foundation. So that's what kept the rails in good order and proper gauge, and that's how these worked. As far as sleeper, that term is still used for, some people still use that for a wooden railroad tie. It is actually a generic term for, I think, from what I understand, for anything that is supporting a railroad track. So as far as why it would be called a sleeper, well, I don't know. I took a nap this afternoon, and lying down in the ground like this would be very, very nice experience if you're tired.
Thanks, Bob. We have a question from Kathleen Applenow.
Go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Bob. So, I was on the ride with you on Saturday, which was just fantastic. And I feel lucky to have had you as a guide and to be riding with so many other interesting people. And I know that we all felt like we wanted another ride. Is there an opportunity beyond Philadelphia to do a ride, maybe not of that length, but to follow the path of the Philadelphia and Columbia?
Of the Philadelphia and Columbia.
Or actually, look, any component of the main line of Public Works that would be close
Oh,
to.
the answer is I could give you 50 rides because explore like Newport, exploring all those towns in Perry County, and it's just I could show you slides right now that would take your breath away. Yeah, it's very doable. And not just for the main line of Public Works, because obviously some of that ended up, sitting, well, there are sections of Canal that you can hike. There are other interesting things like just east of Mapleton, which is east of the town of Huntington. There's a Narrows, and there's a trail called the 1,000 Steps that climbs up to where the workers used to go to mine certain things. But where the railroad goes through there, we were trying to find out a way of how to get through this Narrows, where there's no road, just the railroad. And the room, well, I looked at an old topo map and there was a road up on the hillside. And when we found it, you could go from one valley to the other. And somebody said, "Oh, that's the fire trail." The fire trail? Oh yeah, well, when they had steam locomotives, they were always lighting the woods on fire. So they had this trail where they could go and put the fires out. Just all these things from history. So there's a lot to see, and it's just beautiful. I mean, Pennsylvania, as you know, and the Ridge and Valley country and the mountains is really something special, and the countryside too. One of the things that you may want to look at is there's a map you can get online from DCNR, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, of the major greenways in Pennsylvania. And much of the route, there is a route between Philadelphia and Harrisburg called the Great Schuylkill and Susquehanna Passage. Now, it uses the Schuylkill River Trail, the Chester Valley Trail, the Enola Low Grade Trail. It does go out to Columbia, so there's some of that. And then, of course, the Northwest Lancaster County Trail up to Harrisburg. But, you can parallel a lot of this and see things. Just in the last 2 months, there was a huge bridge at Safe Harbor, trestle. It's the third highest trestle in the United States. Took 9 years to restore. It just opened as part of a multi-use trail. It goes all the way in this greenway. And the greenway was officially announced last year by DCNR. So all those pieces are getting filled in. The other route that you'd want to, which would be quite of interest, is the September 11th National Memorial Trail. And I got to see a lot of this because it follows largely the main line greenway from Johnstown all the way to Harrisburg. So that's the corridor. And I discovered lots of places to explore, trails, bike routes, back roads, small towns, historic sites. It's endless. So you can find their map online at the, it's 911trail.org, September 11th National Memorial Trail, much of which some parts are off-road for miles and miles, other parts are on back roads. The goal is to get it completely off-road, and where they want to put it is on the towpath of the main line of Public Works. Of course, a lot of that is now in private hands, and we did a lot of negotiating, and it wasn't easy. But when that is eventually done, you'll be able to follow for several days the towpath of the Juniata Division of the Pennsylvania Canal, which is part of the main line of Public Works.
That's great. Thanks. That's helpful information.
Yeah, don't hesitate to ask me. And I do get out regularly, so I enjoy going with other people.
Well, maybe we could do another bike ride.
Okay. Yeah, I
Thank
thought it
you,
was,
Bob.
yeah.
So I don't see any more questions, but go ahead and say what I cut you off. What were you about to say?
I was just going to say, one of the other things about this corridor is it's still paralleled by passenger trains. I've explored most of it in central and western Pennsylvania by taking Amtrak to one station, bicycling for a week on, the C&O Canal or something else, and getting back to another station. On Saturday, several of us took the train out from Philadelphia to Villanova and then did the ride. Other people who came from Lower Merion and Haverford and whatnot, Radnor, when they got to Philadelphia, they took the train back to, where they live. So having the train connections makes it really nice. So
Yeah, I was one of those. It worked. I got my train or my bike on that train.
Great. Obviously you're here, so
Yes.
yeah, so that worked out very well for you. And which station's close to you? Winwood?
Yes.
So you just took the train from Jefferson from
Suburban.
Winwood, yeah, suburban.
Yeah, we had 4 of us on a train and it was
Right.
great.
Yep.
Yeah. It was a good learning experience. I know I can do it now.
Right. And there are many, many trips that open up to you when you don't have to bicycle back to where you started from.
Yeah.
The other advantage of that is that the traveling from Villanova, where we were on the main line of Public Works to Center City, you're going downhill several hundreds of feet. So by taking the train uphill, it's like Chutes and Ladders, that game that we played as kids. Okay. Well,
Maureen, do you see any other
hey.
questions?
I don't see any other questions, but if people have any, just please unmute yourself and feel free to ask your question.
Russ Nee here. I would just like to say, Bob, a wonderful evening. You are again just unbelievable. I was lucky enough to go up and down Route 30 with Bob from almost Philadelphia to Gettysburg over the summer. And let me tell you what, it was a great trip. And thank you, sir, for all that you do.
Thank you very much. And I did get your message earlier. Thank you, Russ. Really good to see you.
Yeah, we need to talk, sir.
Okay, I'll give you a holler.
Thank you.
Well,
This is John with another question for Bob. Bob, we're in for Fairmount Park Conservancy hike. We go to the sleeper stones, and people are very curious about the set of stones next to the sleeper stones, and like why they are there, what function they serve. Could you explain those a little better?
The linear stones?
Yeah, they're linear and they kind of parallel the sleeper
Yeah,
stones.
I know exactly what you're saying. And the answer is I don't know. I saw them, I guess I was there a while ago and there were still 2 rows of the sleeper stones, but someone's uncovered these other ones. And what purpose they have, I do not know.
It's better coming from you, Bob. I'm going to tell people that Bob says he doesn't know. If I say I don't know, I just don't know. But
Yeah.
That's if you don't know, then it's really a mystery.
I will tell you that the pleasure of putting this talk together is, the research and spending time, and you go to search for something and that brings you to some website, and now I know a whole bunch that I don't know, so I'll never get bored. I mean, there's always stuff to look at, and obviously one day I'll try to find out what those stones are all about, or someone will tell me.
well, you've got a ready audience here, Bob.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. It was such a pleasure. So interesting. We're so lucky to have you. And thanks to everybody who was on the call and participated. Very, very happy to have you all. So thank you.
This was great. Thank you so much, Bob.
My pleasure, really. Thanks all for taking the time to enjoy this.
All right. Well, good night.
Okay, good
Thank
night.
you, Bob.
Thanks.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Thanks, Bob.
Great job. Thank you.
See you later.